Organized. All right, thank you very much. So I'll just, I'm going to be talking about this topic, it's just transitions to low carbon energy in Japan, which is based on some work, a project that we did over the last 6 months. It was a very short project, and we're still processing the results of it. But basically, I'm collaborating with a colleague, Leslie from the UK, and also another colleague, Andrew, from here in Japan. So just to start, so why thinking about just transitions in Japan? I mean, I guess everybody, well, there's a move to think about just transitions globally, but Japan has been quite slow in its acting on in terms of its I guess in terms of its targets for globally for its for reducing emissions. It's also and I think some of that's been cautioned in the post-Fukushima era. But Japan also has a long history of having to phase out of different sectors, notably coal mining, and also, of course, the Fukushima nuclear accident, which is sort of has forced somewhat a phase out and therefore a transition, although a little bit more sudden. I've just put this graph here as a bit of a note or a support, but if we look at the this is nuclear in its coming through in its glory and basically disappearing for a moment until it's come back to about 5%. Likewise, we've seen coal increase, but this section in particular hopefully decreasing. Most of the coal in Japan, or most energy in Japan, is also imported, so it has a little bit of an interesting difference, perhaps, to many other areas which are thinking about this idea of just transitions. So again, the idea of a just transition in Japan has not really been explored to much of an extent. There are some NGOs and there's a bit of political interest in it, but notably Japan doesn't have much of a workforce in extractive industries. There is a little bit of mining, there's a bit of quarrying, but most of the industry in Japan is downstream. So some of the issues that we'd expect to have in this just transition in Japan are, for example, with workers in thermal sector, in thermal and nuclear power, and nuclear, whilst not being a carbon intensive industry, still does have, well, it still may be part of any transition in Japan, whether transitioning away from or to, we're not quite sure. But also steelworking, petrochemicals and automotive sector, which are energy intensive and therefore reliant in terms of the, or probably going to be affected in any zero carbon society. So I mentioned that Japan has some examples of transitions. Japan, in its after its period of basically global isolation, it rapidly, during the Meiji Restoration, rapidly expanded its industrial sector. And one of the areas which was particularly, well, there were a few areas which were particularly heavily industrialized. Some of the areas in which coal mining was particularly extensive were Mike Omuta and Yubari in Hokkaido. So Mike Omuta is in Kyushu. And these are examples where I guess the transition didn't go so well. So this is, sorry, on the left here, an example of the, both these images are from Mike. But well, Mike and Omuta, this being a big chunk of coal, and apparently Omuta is the home of rocks that burn. But as an example, the Mike mine, which you can see part of the remnants here, was the site of labour disputes in the 1960s over pay and conditions. There were mining accidents, notably in 1963, massive accident, which killed 458 people and affected quite a number with carbon monoxide poisoning. Surprisingly, the mine then went on to keep operating until it finally closed in 1997 and with the loss of 1,200 jobs, which basically decimated that city. So this, like Ubudy, has sort of similar history of struggles among workers and in the mines, and also a history of losing significant amount of jobs. This is just to indicate that the different areas of Japan obviously have different dependencies, and so Hokkaido, which is where Ubudy is now not so dependent on fossil fuel, the fossil fuel sector, but in terms of steel and petrochemicals, it's highly dependent. The other area, Kyushu, which we were looking at here, is highly dependent on steel. Now, when we look at the effect of any transition on the economy, some of the easier aspects to look at are jobs and potentially the flow-on impacts of reducing certain sectors. We can take a guess at that by doing something like input-output assessment. And here we have just presented an example of the influence and sensitivity. So basically, you can see over here a legend around this, but the sector up here, or any of the sectors up in this quadrant, easily influenced and have, whilst also having more impact on other sectors. So these are sectors which can be quite heavily affected by potentially scenarios in terms of reducing CO2 emissions, but at the same time, in this sector, they have an influence on other sectors, meaning that they probably have significant flow-on effects. Whereas you can see that the others are, well, perhaps less influenced or less able to influence. And this different sort of, we've done analysis on different parts of Japan. This is just for Hokkaido, but when you look at different parts of Japan, you'll find, of course, their economic sector is different, and that leads you to well, it can lead to different conclusions or different implications when we think about this low-cost carbon transition. Again, if we look at Hokkaido, we can see how this reflects in terms of employment changes. So we ran a number of scenarios looking at reduction of around about initially 20% of thermal energy, and significant reduction in the amount of energy used, well, particularly fossil fuels used in steel, etc. And you can see that a decrease in the output of these sectors will basically lead to, well, a relatively significant impact in terms of jobs. For Hokkaido, again, steel is quite significant, as well as the electricity sector, if we move away from fossil fuels. Now, the Japanese government has typically had a number of focuses in terms of its energy situation. Sorry, that will disappear. But basically the Japanese government tends to focus on the economy and also on technology as being the two areas which it sees as being able to save it in terms of its growth. Now, this is from its roadmap to beyond zero carbon. So where it's trying to aim, and we can see that the sectors that they see as having potential within a zero carbon society within Japan. So they focus, and notably, you can see here the second point there is hydrogen, CCS, and ammonia. So hydrogen is a really big focus in Japan. Of course, it's become quite popular globally again at the moment as a talking point. But we also, as part of this project, did tried to find out how much people know about this idea of a just transition. Most parts of Japan, it's very low in terms of what they were, whether they knew anything about just transitions. There were two places which stood out, really. So Fukushima, which has obviously had the nuclear accident and subsequently has had a significant focus on trying to societally, support society and recover the society whilst also looking at new energy. And Wakayama, which was interesting, but is an area which has recently had, I think, a COP meeting there, which might have affected the results. The other thing that we were interested in is a few aspects of who should take responsibility. So you can see here that in terms of whose opinion counts most, most people thought that home energy users and research institutes, which is nice for us, are most important in terms of thinking about an energy future. And in terms of those who we should prioritize, basically nobody in particular, but after that is just basically energy consumers and those on low incomes, and ultimately also children. So there is a focus sort of on the future, but also on supporting those who are in the lowest income bracket. Likewise, furthermore, what are they actually willing to do in terms of what actions would they be willing to do to support a just transition? And so of these, many people were theoretically willing to install solar PV or drive a fuel cell vehicle, or increase renewable energy in their energy plan. But there were a lot of them who were not willing to do anything. And what local or national actions would people accept? You can see that there was not so much attraction with putting nuclear in your state or in your town, but they would be very happy to have mega PV or mega solar, mega scale wind farms, and they would be somewhat willing, about the same as putting nuclear, but they're somewhat willing to close mines and close fossil fuel stations. They don't, and likewise, somewhat similar for CCS. And again, nothing still was a high impact. So basically, there's a favorable view of PV and wind. Now, I mentioned hydrogen, and I just want to continue just to highlight this a little bit. This image is from Fukushima Prefecture. We recently visited there. So in Fukushima in particular, they have a lot of, they've actually got a massive rollout of PV, and they also have a focus on all sorts of new energy systems, including hydrogen. There are a few points to note here. So hydrogen is worth considering within a just transition framework, because it's very much focused on by the Japanese government and doesn't really have there's not so much of a just transition focus from the government in hydrogen, but that's probably a good reason to put it in. Also, generally people don't know very much about hydrogen, but we can see a little bit of that in a moment. In Japanese, the hydrogen economy is actually the hydrogen society, while in, so slightly different to English, but so that sort of might give some idea that they should actually focus in terms of the just transition. When we look at awareness though of hydrogen, what is interesting, again, the Japanese government has been pushing this quite a lot. And so back in 2008, a survey had, a large proportion of people who had not heard of hydrogen energy, around about 36%. That's dropped down to about 10% by now. Now you can even hear about hydrogen and fuel cells on the TV. When we look at about energy security, this is from the same hydrogen energy survey. But when we look at so for Japan, they have their basic energy policy is centered around these ideas of the 3E+S. So economic efficiency, energy security, environment, and safety. So when we look at the priority options for people in terms of a hydrogen economy, it's mostly about adopting cleaner technology, stable supply of energy, so making sure we maintain energy, and reducing cost of energy, which we could say obviously links to a just transition. Eventually we get down to reducing dependency on fossil fuels, but fairness for all stakeholders, so producers and consumers sort of across the board, is fairly low. But on the other hand, the Japanese government has quite a strong focus, particularly on ensuring fairness, or ensuring that that new entrants to the market have a fair entry into the market. So it has a focus on new power generators being able to provide energy into the market. I'm going to finish up with just a few key messages from this study so far. One of the key aspects for us from this study is that there's a lot of national talk, perhaps, about this net zero or about a zero carbon transition. But there's an importance of providing benefit from this type of infrastructure to rural and peripheral regions. So some of which are going to have disproportionate share of carbon intensive workers. So often power stations are located in areas which don't have that many people. Nuclear as well as coal or fossil fuel based thermal power stations. So some of those regions have an ability or the right conditions to actually benefit from a low carbon transition, but others may not. So there's a need to support local governments and community organizations to shape that sort of local just transition. The Japanese government, again, tends to focus on quantifiable aspects of transition, so technology and the economy, things which I would say are sort of more contained and again, able to be calculated. So they tend to forget somewhat the general stakeholders or the general consumer. Now, I wanted to just leave with one piece of data here. Sorry, this is cut off at the edge. But what we asked people, what is the most important outcome of a just transition in Japan? And by far the most important was improved health, which is somewhat interesting. If we're talking about a just transition or a transition away from fossil fuels, that health is the most important. It might be reflective of the fact that there are a lot of old people in Japan, but I'm not quite sure how we can dig that out. So lower energy costs and reducing natural disasters, which is something we just can't do with by a just transition, unless we take it a very long bow and say, okay, if we go to a zero carbon situation, then maybe we can reduce weather events like typhoons, etc. I'm going to finish there, and if you're interested, these reports are published they're published online. Not all of what I've shown today will be in there yet, because, as I said, we're still processing the results. Thank you very much, and you're welcome to ask questions.